So yesterday I was watching Greg Terry, as is my custom, and he was talking about Timothy Snyder. Now I've been aware of Timothy Snyder. I've read some of his books, and I've highlighted a number of his videos, little clips of what he has said. And to me, I said, "Hey, we got to talk about this," because to me, he resonated significantly, and apparently he did to you, but probably for different reasons. Maybe I'm coming from the academic side, and you're coming from, look, I've lived there on the ground in Ukraine. He's spot on. So tell me what you were thinking yesterday when you found Timothy Snyder, and I'll tell you that the last thing that I talked about with Timothy Snyder was I was highlighting his root cause of the problem is that the Russians don't see Ukrainians as actual something as actual entities. They are just Russians. They are not Ukrainians. They have no distinct Ukrainian identity. They're just rebellious Russians who need to be clamped down on so that they stop doing what they're doing.
That is the propaganda game they play, and I once I discovered Timothy yesterday and I started deep diving actually about 2 days ago, one of the things that impressed me most, and this may seem off, and then I'll get to your point, he was born in 1969, which puts
Hmm.
him right in that age group of you and I growing up focusing on the Soviet Union, the Cold War, paying attention to it. And there was a
Yep.
segment of American society that we geeked out about it. We had movies like Red Dawn. It was always in our mindset. And of course, that was the era when Ronald Reagan was battling Gorbachev and battling the Soviet system.
Hmm.
So the
So
age is right for me.
you're probably right about that. And to your point, I was just about to say Red Dawn. In fact, I just interlibrary loaned it because I try not to. So you can normally find these kinds of things on like Netflix or whatever. You can only find the remake. The remake has North Korea invading the U.S. Does that sound anything like realistic to you? But
Absolutely
in
not.
1985 or so, like this idea, like, ooh, what if the Russians invaded? Was a real, like, that's the original Red Dawn. Like that was powerful in people's minds, and you'd see things like The Day After, the movie about like nuclear vaporization of whatever. Yeah, so that was a powerful something that affected people our age and up. And in fact, I don't know about you and your YouTube audience. My audience is older than me by far. Uh, like I have maybe 15% that's below 50, and then after that, it's 50 and up.
Mine is as well, and, for me, I enjoy that, to be honest. I enjoy, learning from people in my community, hearing their
Hmm.
wisdom, listening to their chat, reading it because I know there's a lot of experience in there, and I've got about 15 to 20% that is younger than myself, so the demographics are similar, but
Yep.
specifically for those that are younger, when we talk about this man being born in 1969, and this is a real thing. We grew up in the
Hmm.
'80s, and it was a real thing. Learning about the Soviet Union, expecting a nuclear missile, all of these things that you read about or you see about or you look back in history, this was the real deal. So this is why I really respect his opinion. And I know that may sound weird. Oh, just because he was born in that era? Well, that's one of the reasons. The second reason
Yeah.
is his education. He was focused on Eastern European study, Eastern European thought, specific to the Soviet Union, the Soviet system, and on top of that, he paralleled that education with Middle Eastern education, specifically in regard to the Holocaust in World War II. He is an expert on
Hmm.
the things that unfolded during World War II. And we are now seeing so many comparisons. So, his education, the era in which he was born, you know as well as I know, he's a professor at Yale University,
Hmm.
fairly decent institution there. So, um, the man has the resume. So that initially pushes me to listen to what he says more.
Yeah.
Um,
So as you were saying that, I was thinking, yeah, I did my master's thesis on the Nazis. And then the other issue is that people that are of this age or have been over to Eastern Europe are the people that are paying, or Russia are the people that are really paying attention to this. So I've also been to Lithuania and Romania and Bulgaria and even Belarus, believe it or not. And I never made it to Ukraine, but I've been in the neighborhood, and if you've been to a post-Soviet state and you realize what the Soviets, which was largely the Russian base, but the Soviets, what they had done to the people there, you just see it very differently, and you spend all your time there. I mean, like, or a huge chunk of your time there, and so you saw this up close and personal. So it resonated with you, I'm sure, even far more than it resonates with me.
I have spent over 4 years of my life inside Ukraine, and since the full-scale war, I've spent over 1 year of my life coming and going nonstop, to support the war effort there. What people need to understand is when there are decades and decades of a system in place,
Mm,
that system takes generations to filter out. For me right now, even the example comes that sometimes, like if I'm at a family event or a family party, my mother or my grandmother will come to me and they will say, "You're acting just like your great grandfather." I didn't really know my great grandfather. Barely. I remember him as a 3-year old, but that that family trait, that family heritage, it takes time. It's just in you. And even some
yeah.
of my friends in Ukraine, I'll tell them sometimes just joking. I say, "You're so Soviet. You're so Soviet." And they'll go, "I'm trying to get rid of it. I'm trying to get rid of it." But I was born in that system and it takes layers to unpeel. A couple of
Yeah.
other reasons that I really and I'll give you these and then I'll throw it to you. It's really what you just spoke about, spending time in Eastern Europe, as you yourself have done, as I have done. I look at people like a Timothy Snyder, and even now I can throw in Michael McFaul, who was the
Mhm,
ambassador to Russia, speaks Russian fluently. We may not agree on everything politically, but in regard to
mm,
Russia, the man is an expert. He understands the Soviet system. Timothy Snyder, not only focusing his studies there, but he has spent ample time specifically inside Ukraine with multiple lecture series, multiple visits, and specifically unique places in Ukraine. Not only Kiev. When people go to Ukraine, they go to Kiev. Guys, Kiev is so different from other places. And I was reading his biography and his background. He spent time in Dnipro, which is a
mhm,
completely different environment, a completely different city than Kiev. And then additionally, he spent a lot of time in Kharkiv. And we know how
mhm,
important Kharkiv is up in that northeastern corner of Ukraine, where, to be honest, a lot of Soviet influence in Kharkiv. So he has a well-rounded understanding of Ukrainian culture, understanding of Ukrainian and geopolitical matters. And then my third criteria was not only the background, the education, being there, but the man donates. He puts his money where his
mhm.
mouth is, and he tries to help the Ukrainian war effort, specifically in a $1.25 million effort and campaign that he spearheaded to raise awareness and support for air defense.
Yeah, so I've highlighted different things, and we'll talk about the things that grabbed you in just a moment, but I've highlighted different things from Timothy Snyder over time. But the one that really stands out to me, other than what I've already talked about, was he talks about how Russia needs to lose. They need to lose for Russia, not for the West. If Russia loses, it can shed its imperial ambitions. I was just talking about in my morning update this morning about Solioff talking about it's a natural state of man is war. I mean, this we've gotten soft. We need to, rightly or wrongly recognize that war is our natural condition. Well, you need to shake that, right? The Japanese have shook it. The Germans have shook it, but that's only after they lost. And look, all empires. The British had an empire, but eventually they lost that. The French had, like, you just go down the list. The Russians are still like living the dream as if it's the 19th century and a Tsar is still in place. And so they need to lose so that they can rejoin the world and live peaceably amongst the world. And that's a brilliant insight. Okay,
It
so
was
what
one of
stood
my
stood
it
out
was
to
one
you?
of my favorite things that he actually stated because it also shares to me that the man cares about people.
Hmm.
Because there are people out there that just call, well, let's just wipe every Russian off the planet. Let's just erase them. They're all evil. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not true. I have a lot of very good anti Putin, anti Kremlin, anti Russia, pro Ukraine, pro West Russian friends living inside of Russia that I
Mhm,
personally communicate with. I do not want those people erased off the planet. I want them to be a part of building a new Russia, a Russia that is about helping the world because Russia is a place full of resources. There are talented people there. There is beautiful architecture there. And there is a there's something that Russia could actually offer to society if we can get rid of this imperialistic regime and this evil that is there in the Kremlin. And he states it clearly. The only way for Russia to win is for Russia to lose, for Putin to
mhm,
lose. For me, I agree with you completely. It's brilliant because only at that time can Russia begin to rebuild the nation, much like the examples you gave of post World War II Germany and Japan, which are now
mhm,
great nations that support global peace, global initiatives, and are a part of greater society.
mhm. Yeah, and, even if they lose or when they lose, they would still have, some time to shake that, like you were talking about with your acting like your great-grandfather. Um, I when I was in Lithuania, this was in 2001, the first time, we were observing. Now, remember, they only got their independence in 1991, and they would say things that we dubbed the Soviet hangover. I don't know if that kind of phrase makes sense to you, but it was like
Completely.
they weren't that far from when they were dominated by the Soviets that they still thought in these terms. Like they'd say things like, "Well, we just need one good leader to lead us." No, that is not the way that you should be thinking about this. But what did they know? That's how they had been taught and what the state was trying to program into them for a long time. And to their credit, they have masterfully gotten away from that over the last 30 years. But um, yeah, so that hangover is still going to be
It's
there,
still
but they have
there.
to be beaten.
That hangover actually is one of the talking points of MAGA, to be quite honest, and other groups around the world that would focus on the corruption inside Ukraine. I am always
Yeah,
inside
that's right.
Ukraine, and so many times people of the world that are anti-Ukraine, they want to focus on the corruption. And I would just say to those folks respectfully today, um, if you think Ukraine is more corrupt than any other
Yeah.
nation, I'm sorry, but that's not true. It's just highlighted due to this war. Now, the hangover you're referring to, Ukraine is doing their best to break out of that because
Yep.
it's like, okay, well, we have a problem here getting this approved. And it's like when we bring in humanitarian aid, we brought in the 4 armored vehicles. It was not easy. It was not easy because we were
Hmm.
bringing actually in military aid, not a civilian vehicle that's painted green and we take it to an army unit somewhere. These were military vehicles. So it would have been very easy for us to say, let's just go to the regional administrator there at the border and freeze their palm. That's what they would have done. But of
Yeah.
course, we didn't do that. But that's the system they're breaking out of. No, we do this the right way, the proper documentation, the proper papers, the proper paper trail. And it did take us longer, but we did it the right way. And now our vehicles are rolling around Ukraine saving lives, and they are perfectly legal, and nobody can ever fight against them. Now, I will tell you in regard to that, Jania, my partner, your friend, we're talking just yesterday, and this relates to this actual Timothy Snider thing and what we're talking about here. The soldiers are now calling us, our organization, NUPROM, with whom we all partner with to support our hands and feet on the ground there in Ukraine. And they are saying, we only will work with you guys. We only will work with you guys because other organizations have not always done it the right way. They're working so hard to get us aid.
Hmm.
Sometimes they're bending the rules, and we don't want to do that. We wanted to do it. We want to do it legal. And Jania and Greg, we know you do it 100% legal. And we want a new Ukraine. We want to get off and out of this stigma that we're just corrupt and evil because we're not. We're fighting a righteous war and we're trying to do it the right way. So this is a big deal. And Timothy Snyder understands it completely and actually
Yeah, we're
addresses
gonna
it.
get to Timothy in just a moment, and I wanna hit what you think are the highlights, of what he had to say, but because not everybody that I mean, you showed it on your channel, and as much as I direct people to your channel, some
Mhm.
people on my channel, for example, have not seen these things, but, it's fascinating how different Ukraine and, Russia have diverged over time, and I think this is part of what, sticks in Putin's craw is the idea that not only is Ukraine not in its orbit anymore, but it is a completely different view of how the world can work. Where Russia is becoming increasingly more authoritarian, not Marxist, but authoritarian, and going back toward a Soviet kind of way. Ukraine is running headlong to the West, and they're very very different.
It is obvious when it's obvious when you can understand the Russian language. And when you can understand the Russian language, you can watch videos of Russian bloggers, of some more stable news reporters, of which there are very few, but there are a few, that actually have come to Ukraine during the war, and they are shocked to learn that what they are inundated with information about Ukraine is not actually true. They are
Mm,
surprised at the infrastructure. They're surprised how Ukrainians live. They are surprised that Ukrainians are kind. They're surprised that they're not seeing
mm,
everything that they are indoctrinated with, whether it's in Kiev or Kharkiv or wherever they're visiting. I have seen many of these videos, and it's in Russian language, so you have to understand Russian to really get the full force of it. But the reality is, Russia and Ukraine have a complete divergence, and Ukraine is
yeah,
heading to the west, and Russia hates it, absolutely hates it.
yeah. All right, let's get to Timothy Snyder because that's what we're talking about here. So, what are the points that really jumped out to you most? Like the arguments that he made that you were like, "Wow, that really resonated."
Well, the first thing I would say is why I listened to his arguments. There was one other piece I wanted to give, and that was not only his education and his era and his experience and his willing to give, but also he understands it to the point, and this is a validated fact, New York Times op-ed piece he wrote in 2014, where he predicted the takeover of Crimea and the invasion of Crimea. So when you have a historian, which he is a historian, and
Hmm.
they're analyzing the facts, this just spurs me. So the things we're going to chat about here now that he stated over the last few days in Kiev, um, he has the resume to talk about it. So the first thing he said was Ukraine is a key place in history geopolitically. And the
Hmm.
narrative that there is no Ukraine, or that Ukraine is just this tiny little blip, this little region inside of
Hmm.
sovereign Ukraine, it's actually our land, it's Novorossiya, and it's just a little strip of peace between Europe and Russia. And we Ukraine is basically Russian. He debunks that argument completely and stands against it. So number one, he understands that Ukraine is Ukraine.
Hmm. And the Russians fight that narrative tooth and nail in their propaganda. And it's even in their language, like when they're talking about Ukraine and translating into Little Russia
Mhm.
or to, calling it that sort of thing. Did I tell you at Christmas, I got this little globe thing that talks about all the different nations of the world. You can touch it. It's for my kids, right? It's like educational toy, tricks them into thinking that they're having fun while they're learning something. Right? But you touch it and it talks about Ukraine, like, when you touch Ukraine, it talks about Ukraine and talks about facts, and it said Little Russia in there. I went ballistic. I really but
Well, let me
that's the
it's
yeah.
interesting that you say that. Yesterday, I was working on some graphics for my presentation about Timothy Snyder, and I was trying to pull up an international map. And I was using a program, canva.com. I do it, that's easy to do a lot of graphic working for me personally. And I just pulled up world map. And this was an interesting, unique little map that had the outline of how the continents are. And instead of the land and borders, they just put the country names in there. And you've seen maps like that. There
Mhm.
wasn't even a Ukraine on the map. It was Russia.
Oh,
Right.
wow.
I couldn't believe it. And so I also was very upset about that. But that's a whole different topic about what's happening in society as far as Ukraine. But he refers Russia refers to it as Novorossiya, which means
Mhm,
new Russia. But I
mhm,
will tell you this from a Ukrainian perspective: literally everywhere you go inside Ukraine, you will see bumper stickers. And if you want one, you can go into the two prominent gas stations, which are Volg and Oko. And Oko is the gas station that Zelensky always visits and does his speech and signs his flags. It's always in Oko. And I typically try to go to Okos. I like them. But inside those, you can get bumper stickers for your car. And one of the top selling phrases and bumper stickers that you will find inside Ukraine is this: "Se будет Ukraina," which means all will be Ukraine. They
hmm,
understand the narrative. "Все будет Украина." All will be Ukraine. So that narrative that Russia is pushing, that there is no Ukraine or it's this tiny, that is why Ukraine is replying back even on these bumper stickers. And that's a part of the cultural understanding of why I appreciate somebody like Timothy Snyder, because
yeah.
he gets it. Say будет Ukraina. Everybody, you can walk on the street. If you know that phrase and you go up to somebody and say будет Ukraina, they will give you a hug because it means Ukraine will be Ukraine. The second thing that he talked about that really grabbed my attention was we need to be honest. Russia right now is winning the psychological warfare and starting to gain a couple of key physical battles. But in general, Ukraine has done an amazing job of defense for what they are fighting with, how they are having to fight, and who they are fighting against. But if the West is going to assist in winning this war, we must recognize that we have lost some psychological battles and we need to back up, change our strategy, and go forward. I completely agree with that. I specifically spoke about how many in the West, led by Donald Trump in this case, just honestly, I think they just believe it. They can end the war in 24 hours. Well, you've already lost that psychological battle. You can't end
Mhm,
this war in 24 hours. Secondly, we have tried to respond to this war, we being the West, tried to respond to this war in our Western thinking, making plans in the last decade, let's say from 2014 to 2024. But Russia
mhm.
has been preparing for this for 7 decades. You go back to 1950s with Nikita Khrushchev. And many people say, oh, it's not connected. Tim Snyder gets it. It's all connected. So
It's connected.
we need an adjustment in our mentality, is what he's saying. And I completely agree with that.
So I know Zelensky's not everybody's cup of tea, but Zelensky's the right man in the right moment for that aspect of this war. So I read every speech of Zelensky's for the first 3 or 4 months. That's kind of the nerdiest thing you're going to hear today,
Other
but
than your t-shirt.
but
The other
I
nerdiest
read
thing is your t-shirt.
yeah, 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 which is ironic considering my pronunciation of things. Yeah. It works well at school. It's not so great when I pronounce things wrong on the YouTube channel, but yeah. But so but he was masterful at having the media background in order to frame issues or reframe issues appropriately to foreign entities when he's going to the British Parliament and invoking Churchill, and when he's talking about in Canada uh, and Prime Minister Justin, what if rockets were raining down on the tower in Toronto, right? I mean, like he's putting it in perspective, right? Uh,
The
Churchill was the right guy at the moment as World War II was beginning, but he was the wrong guy, or would have been the wrong guy a decade earlier. Reagan's media savvy helped him significantly, and I think Zelensky has that same kind of ability to help push back. And I don't know that a Poroshenko would have been able to do a fraction of what Zelensky's been able to do as far as pushing back on the info war, if that makes sense.
I completely agree with that. And when you if you want to bring up Poroshenko, no, he would not have been. First of all, he comes from a completely different background. Peter Poroshenko is
Mhm.
actually inside Ukraine called Tsar Shokolad, which means chocolate king.
Chocolate,
So
yeah.
chocolate Tsar Shokolad, and he's the chocolate king. So inside Ukraine, the number one chocolate candy, like in the U.S., it's like Hershey's. Over there, it's called Roshen, Roshen. Well, think about this. Poroshenko. Poroshenko. It's his company, Roshan. And he comes from a business background. Of course, he has ties and connections globally, and that is against him. Not saying he's anti-Ukraine or any of that, but it's a completely different background. Zelensky comes from the background of being a professional communicator. You
Mhm.
stated Ronald Reagan. Ronald
Mhm.
Reagan was thinking about the Soviet Union even during the time that he was the president of the Screen
Governor.
Actors Guild in Los Angeles, fighting
Yeah.
against communism even back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s prior to his governorship, and that was inside of him. This is why
Yep.
Zelensky stated on American media, and I believe this was directed to anybody that would think opposite in regard to how to end this war. He said, and I'm basically quoting, "You do not understand Vladimir Putin, but we do. You do not know how to fight Vladimir Putin, but we do.
Mhm.
So if you will help us, we will do the fighting because we understand how to fight against this regime that's in the Kremlin, led by Vladimir Putin. He is spot on. He gets it. He is the right man. He's been the right communicator. It doesn't mean that there's not been bumpy roads. It is a war. It is a
Mhm.
war of epic proportion. And that actually leads me to the next point, to be quite honest, where Timothy Snyder talked about the invasion of Kursk was vital for the world to understand that this is a war. He spoke then about sovereign borders. And when
Mhm.
Russia invaded, the full scale invasion in 2022, they were calling it a special military operation. And then, through the last few years, YouTubers and media people have listened for Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov or Dmitry Peskov to drop the word war. Of course, the propagandists drop it all the time. And there have been occasions where we've heard even Putin himself say, war and not special
Mhm.
military operation. Maybe it slipped or maybe he did it intentionally. But the reality is, it was still an invasion of a sovereign nation. Russia invaded Ukraine. Timothy Snyder's understanding is not only was it good for Ukraine to strike Kursk to show that they had the capability, the ability, the quality of soldiers, the ability to punch back, even strategically. Okay, Russia may have to rotate some troops around, but that's not the big deal. Zelensky himself said, "You can see on the outside we have invaded Kursk. You can see some logical understanding of why we're invading Kursk, whatever that may be, troops,
Mhm.
transitions, but there are other reasons we are invading Kursk that we have not shared with you." I personally think that this would coincide with what Timothy Snyder said, and that is Ukraine needed to cross that border to fight inside of Russia to validate to the world, to global support, to the community, to Western nations that not only do they have the ability to fight a war, but this is actually a war. They're not just
Yeah.
being invaded, and as the West would say many times, begging for weapons or receiving 60 billion every other month, which is all propaganda and lies. But the reality
Mhm.
is, it's a full blown war. And I was even sharing that we look on the media right now, and dominating the media is the war in Israel. And we see the F-35s and the F-16s, and they go to Beirut and they unleash hell on Beirut, and we see the explosions, and we look at that and go, "Oh my goodness, what power, what they're doing there in Beirut." And wherever you stand on that politically is on you. That's not what I'm talking about. We can just see that destruction coming down. My friends, Beirut is tiny. That
Mhm.
destruction is raining down on Ukraine, 1,500-kilometer long front lining, including the Sumy and Kursk borders against
Yeah.
Russia. This is a massive war that personally, I don't think the world recognizes yet how big and bad it is.
Yeah, and Snyder was right on point because it that invasion altered the center of gravity of the war, and I know at the time people were like, "Hey, why are they doing this? They should be bolstering the front line by Pokrovsk." It was brilliant to do that. It changed the dynamics radically. Okay, what else?
He said, Ukraine defenders, I speak to them regularly. And with this one, I can concur. I am embedded with defenders nonstop.
Mhm.
They right now are experiencing a mood swing, up emotions, down emotion. So we tell the truth here. These are human beings.
Mhm.
Ukrainian soldiers are not robots. They're not the $6 million men and women. They're humans. And they see so much destruction and hell. I try to describe to people, and it's indescribable, to stand in a group of buildings that are all leveled to the ground. There is
Yeah.
something, excuse me, but spiritual about it, emotional.
Mhm.
You can feel the darkness, you can feel the evil. You see the teddy bears laying on the ground, the shoes over in the corner that have fallen out of somebody's closet. You can see the child's work desk hanging on where this building didn't completely fall. And it's mind numbing. And these soldiers are seeing it every day. So
Yeah.
logically, mood up, mood down, mood up, mood down. And so many people are interjecting into that, that, okay, the morale's down. We're probably going to be in trouble now. That's not the truth. The truth is that is a normal emotion when you're experiencing what they're experiencing. But the end result at the end of the day, and I concur completely, he said in that interview 2 days ago or 3 days ago, no question, Ukrainian soldiers will never quit because they know what
Mhm.
they're fighting for.
Yeah, and if you have a big enough why, anything, is I mean, the why is a force multiplier. If I'm fighting because I get a paycheck, that's very different than fighting for my family. Um,
Well, that's a
somebody
motivational thing I talk about all the time when I'm speaking out at different places. It's important to know your what, but what's more important is to know your why. And
Yep.
when you know your why, there's nothing that can stop you. And that pushes me to the next things. The soldiers are not going to quit. And he then went on to talk about negotiations, and we can maybe combo that with ceasefire. Negotiations that will lead to a ceasefire are a mistake and will not happen. He says because
Mhm.
if that happens and we go into an 18-month ceasefire, Russia will come back. If there
Mhm.
is no loss, if they are not defeated on the battlefield, they
That's
will
right.
come back. And he said, if there is a ceasefire, the West better load the tractor trailers and the trains and arm Ukraine to the hilt to make a statement, but also to prepare them because it will not be over. So we coming out of that soldier morale question where he says, regardless of the up and downs, they will not quit. He then spoke geopolitically, stating ceasefire and truce are off the table. And we've heard Zelensky say that. He goes, no, there's not going to be a ceasefire. There's not going to be a negotiation the way you're saying. People want to start talking about, well, they're talking about this peace plan. They're talking about trying to get Russia there this fall, maybe negotiated by Turkey. That was just coming out last night, a little more clarity on that. But guys, Ukraine gets it. They get it.
Mhm.
We need to trust their lead on this. We can't just freeze this conflict or negotiate our way out at this point.
No, nothing good will come of that. And to his greater point earlier, Russia simply has to lose the idea that this is okay to be doing, to still have the imperial 19th century mindset. Um, yeah, Putin talks about how the greatest geopolitical disaster was the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he's almost right. The greatest geopolitical disaster was the Soviet Union, not the breakup of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union itself, and the horror and destruction that came from the Soviet Union and the Cold War that followed and the domination over Eastern European states. And so he said it a little wrong. The breakup of I would take away from that sentence, but yeah, but that's
What's
still the
interesting for me
mentality.
is you made points earlier, even speaking historically, about the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French, um, and just reality of history. What's interesting
Hmm.
is Britain is still here and they are being a great member of society. France is still
Hmm.
here, being a great member of society. We don't have to agree with everything these nations do, but in general, we're friends and we work together.
Hmm.
The same with Spain and Italy, and we can look at different regions throughout the world. But the Soviet Union that they're trying to still hang on to, it's a baby when you look at world history. It's a baby. It has not been around for hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of years. It came and it was a epic disaster. I completely agree
Mhm,
with you. Even the creation of it geopolitically was an epic disaster, and now we're having to deal with the fallout of that. And I'm really hoping that this is going to be the last chapter to that, and I believe it will be if Vladimir Putin is defeated. And that leads me to the final point he made that for me really hit home, and I tried to communicate this. He made the statement that when we look at Ukraine right now, and let's just take the rough number, 20% of that sovereign nation is under occupation.
mhm.
There is one thing for 20% of a small nation, and I'm not belittling small nations geographically, but Ukraine is a relatively large nation. So when you talk about 20%, it's a lot of territory. And 20% of that is under occupation. I try to share with folks, think about where you're sitting right now. Think about your home. Could you imagine 20% of your nation being under occupation? And how would that sit with you?
Mm.
And of course, everybody in the chat going, no way, no way. I said, okay, well, that's where Ukraine is. And his final point was if there is no respect in 2024 for sovereign borders and international law, and political stability through the rule of law and the understanding of borders and systems, then his question was, what do we really have? And my
Yeah.
answer to that was we have chaos and we have nothing. If there's no
Yeah,
respect
might
for
makes
that.
right, and, bad actors are gonna do bad things, and they're gonna be more likely to do it because they see this example and he got away with it, so why can't I do it too? That's exactly right. To put that in perspective, Ukraine's about the size of Texas, and about a landmass about the size of North Carolina is under Russian control within Texas.
Oh, that's a great, I need to remember
So
that.
just
Yeah.
because I looked that up once just to kinda get a sense of that. I'm not sure how well that'll translate to my European audience, but as far as an American audience, that should make some sense.
Well, for many of the European nations, I had spending a lot of time in Europe. For most of the nations, your the size geographically of your nation is smaller than 20% of Ukraine uh,
Mhm,
in square kilometers. So
mhm.
your entire nation would be occupied. That's the scope and scale of how much territory is under
Is it also
occupation.
smaller in square miles? I'm not sure how that translates.
Well, we'll have to do some calculations on that one. You have the grammar T-shirt on. I will go after this and put my math T-shirt on.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I just
Well, I will
anyway.
tell you this, and we're closing, and we'll make it a little light. Every time I spend so much time in Ukraine, I think in kilometers now because there's no mileage talk there. Everything's in kilometers, and I can calculate in kilometers. Um, but my wife will come down after my streams and goes, "Listen, that was really good. I was up here watching it, enjoy it. But so how many miles is that?" Stop saying kilometers. I said, "Honey,
Yeah. I
it's
understand.
I get it, but I'll try to do the math for you."
But in summary to what we were talking about, Snyder's brilliant.
Yes.
Uh, I read the Road to Unfreedom. Somebody actually sent me the Kindle, like the gifted me the Kindle of the Road to Unfreedom, which I greatly appreciate because I hadn't read it before that, and I just went, wow, he's really on the pulse of some things. And again, I don't necessarily see everything the same way, but as far as his general understanding of how Ukraine and Russia are and interact with each other. I think he's spot on.
He is, and I, completely concur with you. And I would say this, here we are this morning. I have a Ukrainian flag behind me. You have a signed battle flag hanging up there, the wall behind you. You have your
I
American
do.
flag, your books, a beautiful blue and yellow background. We support Ukraine. Tim Snider supports Ukraine. And this is where I would like to close. For me, our job is not as a human is not to agree with each other on everything. That's
Mhm.
just we're humans. But when our division and the things that we do disagree on separate us to the point that we cannot accentuate the things that we do agree on, and probably
Right.
look at life in general and say, there's actually more we agree on than we disagree on. Unfortunately, now, and you and I are both Americans, we're here and we're in a very difficult election season with mud being slung daily and a lot
Mhm.
of it. It's a tough election. And I look at that and I say, man, can't we just come together? Can't we find some common ground? And yes, for Timothy Snyder, I may not agree with everything he stands for politically, which I do not. But I'm telling you right now, when it comes to Ukraine, Eastern European studies, World War II, Russia,
Mhm.
Vladimir Putin, Ukraine, if I had to pick an all-star team, he's going to be my first draft choice. The man knows
Yep.
what he's talking about. And
Yep.
I appreciate him and I want to accentuate him, encourage people to follow him. If you see him somewhere doing a lecture, go listen to it, read his books, watch his YouTube
Plenty on
videos.
YouTube.
Yes.
He's done lots of stuff on YouTube, so, go look at it, inform yourself, get to understand the way that he's thinking, because he's pretty accurate.
And I hope that just sets the example. We really are trying to bring people together, and we will continue to do that. I know Prof and I speak about that almost daily. So that's our goal, to bring people together.
Yep. You can learn from and now Snyder, is not what I'm about to say, but you can learn from people all over the map that you don't agree with this, but you can agree with learn from that, and so look for the places where you can find commonality. So, anyway, I'm
Completely
not gonna
agree.
get back on that soapbox.
No, you're going to go correct grammar.
Yeah. Well, I actually have to go grade some papers now. So, Greg, it was nice talking to you as
Thank you,
always.
brother.
Thank you for your insights there. I just want to make sure that my audience at least also got to see some of what you covered yesterday. And if you haven't seen Greg's channel, go over to at Greg Terry Experience. And he's got a great deal of insight. He's been on the ground. You'll see if you go back into his back catalog, lots of places in Ukraine where you'll see him actually there interacting with people and as he's delivering humanitarian aid and that sort of thing. So
Thank you,
be sure
Prof.
to do that. All right.
Appreciate you and appreciate your audience and mine as well. If you're here and you're watching on my channel and you haven't found Prof, Professor Gertis Explains UA, go check it out and subscribe there as well. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you later.
Have a good day.